Good afternoon. My name is Michael Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the My Brother's Keeper Alliance at the Obama Foundation. Thank you all for joining us for this critical and important conversation today. The killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the loss of far too many Black lives to list have left our nation anguished and outraged. More than 1,000 people are killed by police every year in America, and Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed than white people. We can take steps and make reforms to combat police violence and systemic racism within law enforcement. Together, we can work to redefine public safety so that it recognizes the humanity and the dignity of every person. This town hall that we're having today is a part of an ongoing My Brother's Keeper Alliance town hall series. My Brother's Keeper was launched by President Obama in 2014 after the tragic killing of Trayvon Martin. The president launched it in the East Room of the White House, calling on America and everybody to do whatever they could in their power to make sure young men of color knew that they matter and to reduce the systemic barriers that stand in their way and make sure every young person has every opportunity to reach their dreams. Today, the work of My Brother's Keeper continues as the My Brother's Keeper Alliance at the Obama Foundation, where we lead a network of more than 250 communities and a massive call to action to businesses, mayors, and other folks in communities across the country. Our mission is to build safe and supportive communities where boys and young men of color are valued and have clear pathways to opportunity. We're excited to have President Obama sharing his viewpoints today, but also gathered a panel of local and national experts who are fighting on the ground and who have been fighting this fight for many years. Before we start our program today, I want to acknowledge the lives of George, of Breonna, of Ahmaud, and far too many others by taking a 30-second moment of silence in order to remember those lives and reflect. Please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. We speak their names, we hold them in our heart, and it is with their memories that we move ahead in action. It is now my pleasure to start where we should always start, with the future, with a young man that I had the pleasure to meet when we were at the My Brother's Keeper Ohio conference, where there is an incredible statewide network of My Brother's Keeper in Ohio. This young man, Playon Patrick, blew us away with his incredible words. Playon graduated from Fort Hays High School in Columbus, Ohio in May, class of 2020. He was a straight A student, member of the National Honor Society, and a student council. Patrick will attend The Ohio State University in the fall and plans to major in criminal justice and criminology. It is my pleasure to introduce this brilliant, bright young man, our future, Playon Patrick.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Playon Patrick. I am 18 years old and plan to attend The Ohio State University. And this is 2020 Quarantine Killings. And they ask, how do Black boys write about their city? How do we know street if we don't know uncracked sidewalk? They ask, how do these Black boys know anything about their city? How the buildings are sitting on corners where brothers' bodies are still learning how to rot. There are small crosses placed in the grass where families cannot afford to bury their loved ones. Reminds my brothers and I that we are early graves before we are anything else. We call those corners playgrounds. We call those corners the killing fields. We call our bodies bullets. Even if we were never aimed in the right direction, we call the remnants of our mother's family the diaspora tree. We make a catalog of prayers out of broken hands. We pray for our family tree to make its way back home to this soil. We use our hands to dig the graves we cannot afford. We are farmers of broken Black bodies. We have never known city, never known comfort, never known safe street in any city. We use our feet to walk streets paved by sunlight and ask our shadows if they meant to choose this skin. We make a catalyst of bodies, our dinner menu, and we eat with our eyes closed. We are fed lies so easily it tastes like medicine, always conflicted between being Black and being people. I wish God could have given us a choice. For years, we have been told that there is something we need to scrub off this body, as if this dirt could go away. Working in the field make you realize how easily Black can cook in the sun, how easily we turn on each other for a little slice of the pie. We don't know this city, how it was built with our grandmother's authentic hands, how we couldn't have gotten a house or a bed when it was first built, when it was first settled, when it was first taken from the Indians, when our gods believed in the same beginning. We don't know home. We know how generations of our people could use these legs, could run miles on end into the night, our faces bedazzled with the remnants of the stars. We will forever search for our forefathers' footsteps. We don't know home. We know run. We know this land has never been ours. We know how to fold ourselves into nothing. We know our sweat and tears tenderize this soil. Somehow we make fertilizer for the soul. We know how to make these hands be useful. We are the farmers of every revolution. No country was built without the piling up of dead bodies. This country just happens to be where our dead were dragged and hung up. America, the land of the free and home of the brave. We fought and died for that slogan, right beside our white brothers. And doesn't that make us worth something? Tonight, a riot is the language of the unheard. I want to take a second to thank the MBK Village and the Obama Foundation for giving me such a great opportunity to continue to spread the message. Now, it is my honor to introduce to you a man who needs no introduction. He is the founder of the My Brother's Keepers program. He is a father, lawyer, lecturer, community organizer, and so much more. Born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, he is the man who changed America forever. It is none other than the 44th president of the United States of America, President Barack Obama.
Man, thank you. Man, that was unbelievable. And we could not be prouder. And you are a hard act to follow. So, I can't wait to see all the great things that you're going to be doing in the future. Good afternoon, everybody. All the participants, all the panelists. Let me start by just acknowledging that we have seen in the last several weeks, last few months, the kinds of epic changes and events in our country that are as profound as anything that I've seen in my lifetime. And I'm now a lot older than planned. I'm going to be 59 soon. And let me begin by acknowledging that although all of us have been feeling pain, uncertainty, disruption, some folks have been feeling it more than others. Most of all, the pain that's been experienced by the families of George and Brianna and Ahmad and Tony and Sean and too many others to mention, those that we thought about during that moment of silence. And to those families who've been directly affected by tragedy, please know that Michelle and I and the nation grieve with you, hold you in our prayers. We're committed to the fight of creating a more just nation in memory of your sons and daughters. And we can't forget that even as we're confronting the particular acts of violence that led to those losses, our nation and the world is still in the midst of a global pandemic that's exposed the vulnerabilities of our healthcare system, but also the disparate treatment and, as a consequence, the disparate impact that exists in our healthcare system, the unequal investment, the biases that have led to a disproportionate number of infections and loss of life in communities of color. So in a lot of ways, what has happened over the last several weeks is challenges and structural problems here in the United States have been thrown into high relief. They're the outcomes not just of the immediate moments in time, but they're the result of a long history of slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and institutionalized racism that too often have been the plague, this original sin of our society. And in some ways, as tragic as these past few weeks have been, as difficult and scary and uncertain as they've been, they've also been an incredible opportunity for people to be awakened to some of these underlying trends. And they offer an opportunity for us to all work together to tackle them, to take them on, to change America and make it live up to its highest ideals. And part of what's made me so hopeful is the fact that so many young people have been galvanized and activated and motivated and mobilized. Because historically, so much of the progress that we've made in our society has been because of young people. Dr. King was a young man when he got involved. Cesar Chavez was a young man. Malcolm X was a young man. The leaders of the feminist movement were young people. Leaders of union movements were young people. The leaders of the environmental movement in this country and the movement to make sure that the LGBT community finally had a voice and was represented were young people. And so when sometimes I feel despair, I just see what's happening with young people all across the country and the talent and the voice and the sophistication that they're displaying. And it makes me feel optimistic. It makes me feel as if, you know, this country is going to get better. Now, I want to speak directly to the young men and women of color in this country who, as Playon just so eloquently described, have witnessed too much violence and too much death. And too often, some of that violence has come from folks who were supposed to be serving and protecting you. I want you to know that you matter. I want you to know that your lives matter, that your dreams matter. And when I go home and I look at the faces of my daughters, Sasha and Malia, and I look at my nephews and nieces, I see limitless potential that deserves to flourish and thrive. And you should be able to learn and make mistakes and live a life of joy without having to worry about what's going to happen when you walk to the store or go for a jog or are driving down the street or looking at some birds in a park. And so I hope that you also feel hopeful, even as you may feel angry, because you have the power to make things better, and you have helped to make the entire country feel as if this is something that's got to change. You've communicated a sense of urgency that is as powerful and as transformative as anything that I've seen in recent years. I want to acknowledge the folks in law enforcement that share the goals of reimagining policing, because there are folks out there who took the oath to serve your communities and your countries, have a tough job, and I know you're just as outraged about the tragedies in recent weeks as are many of the protesters. And so we're grateful for the vast majority of you who protect and serve. I've been heartened to see those in law enforcement who've recognized, let me march along with these protesters. Let me stand side by side and recognize that I want to be part of the solution. and who've shown restraint and volunteered and engaged and listened, because you're a vital part of the conversation. And change is going to require everybody's participation. Now, when I was in office, as was mentioned, I created a task force on 21st century policing in the wake of the tragic killing of Michael Brown. That task force, which included law enforcement and community leaders and activists, was charged to develop a very specific set of recommendations to strengthen public trust and foster better working relationships between law enforcement and communities that they're supposed to protect, even as they're continuing to promote effective crime reduction. And that report showcased a range of solutions and strategies that were proven and that were based on data and research to improve community policing and collect better data and reporting and identify and do something about implicit bias and how police were trained and reforms to use the force that police deploy in ways that increase safety rather than precipitate tragedy. And that report demonstrated something that's critical for us today. Most of the reforms that are needed to prevent the type of violence and injustices that we've seen take place at the local level. Now, reform has to take place in more than 19,000 American municipalities, more than 18,000 local enforcement jurisdictions. And so as activists and everyday citizens raise their voices, we need to be clear about where change is going to happen and how we can bring about that change. It is mayors and county executives that appoint most police chiefs and negotiate collective bargaining agreements with police unions. And that determines police practices in local communities. It's district attorneys and state's attorneys that decide typically whether or not to investigate and ultimately charge those involved in police misconduct. And those are all elected positions. And in some places, they're police community review boards with the power to monitor police conduct. Those oftentimes may be elected as well. The bottom line is, I've been hearing a little bit of chatter in the internet about voting versus protest, politics and participation versus civil disobedience and direct action. This is not a either or. This is a both and. To bring about real change, we both have to highlight a problem and make people in power uncomfortable, but we also have to translate that into practical solutions and laws that can be implemented and we can monitor and make sure we're following up on. So, very quickly, let me just close with a couple of specific things. What can we do? Number one, we know there are specific evidence-based reforms that, if we put in place today, would build trust, save lives, would not show an increase in crime. Those are included in the 21st Century Policing Task Force report. You can find it on obama.org. Number two, a lot of mayors and local elected officials read and supported the task force report, but then there wasn't enough follow-through. So today I am urging every mayor in this country to review your use of force policies with members of your community and commit to report on planned reforms. What are the specific steps you can take? And I should add, by the way, that the original task force report was done several years ago. Since that time, we've actually collected data, in part because we implemented some of these reform ideas. So we now have more information and more data as to what works. And there are organizations like Campaign Zero and Color of Change and others that are out there highlighting what the data shows, what works, what doesn't in terms of reducing incidents of police misconduct and violence. Let's go ahead and start implementing those. So we need mayors, county executives, others who are in positions of power to say, this is a priority. This is a specific response. Number three, every city in this country should be a My Brother's Keeper community, because we have 250 cities, counties, tribal nations who are working to reduce the barriers and expand opportunity for boys and young men of color through programs and policy reforms and public-private partnerships. So go to our website, get working with that because it can make a difference. And let me just close by saying this. I've heard some people say that you have a pandemic, then you have these protests. This reminds people of the 60s and the chaos and the discord and distrust throughout the country. I have to tell you, although I was very young when you had riots and protests and assassinations and discord back in the 60s, I know enough about that history to say there is something different here. You look at those protests, and that was a far more representative cross-section of America out on the streets, peacefully protesting, and who felt moved to do something because of the injustices that they had seen. That didn't exist back in the 1960s, that kind of broad coalition. The fact that recent surveys have showed that despite some protests having then been marred by the actions of some, a tiny minority that engaged in violence, that despite, as usual, that got a lot of attention, a lot of focus, despite all that, a majority of Americans still think those protests were justified. That wouldn't have existed 30, 40, 50 years ago. There is a change in mindset that's taking place, a greater recognition that we can do better. And that is not as a consequence of speeches by politicians. That's not the result of, spotlights in news articles. That's a direct result of the activities and organizing and mobilization and engagement of so many young people across the country who put themselves out on the line to make a difference. And so I just have to say thank you to them and for helping to bring about this moment, and just make sure that we now follow through. Because at some point, attention moves away. At some point, protests start to dwindle in size. And it's very important for us to take the momentum that has been created as a society, as a country, and say, let's use this to finally have an impact. All right? Thank you, everybody. Proud of you guys. And I know that we're going to be hearing from a bunch of people who have been on the front lines on this and know a lot more than I do about it. Proud of you.
Thank you, Mr. President. For everyone that's watching, the president decided he wanted to stay and be a part of the conversation that's going to be led by Brittany Packnett-Cunningham with the Attorney General and other leaders. Before we go into that section, I want to reiterate the pledge that the president mentioned for mayors. So if you are a mayor, you can go to obama.org and you can take this pledge. And I also want to announce that several mayors have said, sign me up first, and they have already taken the pledge. Mayor de Blasio of New York, Mayor Lightfoot of Chicago, Mayor Frey of Minneapolis, Mayor Bowser of DC, Mayor Breed of San Francisco, and Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms of Atlanta, all My Brother's Keeper communities as well. So if you go to that page, you can take the pledge, and we will be posting all the cities and all the mayors that take the pledge. And then in 90 days, we are going to publicly report out who has taken the pledge and the work that's happening to create real lasting change in communities. So it is now my pleasure to introduce a friend, an activist, an educator, a writer, an NBC and MSNBC News contributor, a lifelong activist and member of the Ferguson Uprising, co-founder of Campaign Zero, a policy platform to end police violence, and co-host of Pod Save the People. Previously, she was an appointed member of the Ferguson Commission and President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Today, Campaign Zero, of which Brittany is a co-founder, launched the campaign #8Can'tWait, an advocacy campaign to push mayors across America to adopt 8 use-of-force policies that together can reduce police violence by upwards of 70%. To moderate this conversation with President Obama and our other incredible leaders, please welcome Brittany Packnett-Cunningham.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, President Obama, for gathering this conversation in this moment of intense grief, but hopefully intense purpose. We are here together to talk, to have a family conversation. And you may be watching this and have come here because you are experiencing that grief and you need some community in which to do that. And you're hoping that we can hold you up to the light. You may be here because, like me, you are girded in the strength of your ancestry, and you know you come from people just like I do, who did far more with far less and are sure that we can win in this moment and everyone after it. However you have come here, why you have come here, we're glad that you're here, because we're here to get honest, to get clear, most importantly, to get to work. So that even the heartening moments of seeing people raise their voices, or even in the moments where a police officer might take a knee, that momentary action might turn into true systemic and lasting change. We have so many brilliant voices that have been gathered. And as we listen to these guests, we'll all be able to better understand how we got to this moment and how we seize our own power to get through it. Before we get started, like Michael, I want to make sure to lift up the names of the people who brought us here, because it wasn't just the former president, though we're deeply grateful. It was George Floyd, a father in Minneapolis. It was Breonna Taylor, a life-saving EMT on the front lines in Louisville. It was Sean Reed, a friend and a brother in Indianapolis. It was Tony McDade, a Black trans man who loved life in Tallahassee, Florida. And though it wasn't from an officer's bullet, we are having this conversation, of course, in the shadow of Ahmaud Arbery, a son from Georgia, and Nina Pop and Ayanna Dior, two Black trans women who were killed by systemic hatred that comes against intersectionally marginalized people in this country every single day. Frankly, there are too many names to list because, as the president has already said, we have been at this, unfortunately, for a long time. So that means that there is indeed work to do, and now we're going to get to do it. So, Attorney General Holder, I actually want to start with you. I was raised always to be an activist. So frankly, if you ask my mom, this is the only life I've ever known. But I came into the work specifically of fighting against the scourge of police violence as it relates especially to systemic racism in 2014, when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, just a few minutes from my own home. And you came to Ferguson. And as you know, there were thousands, literally thousands of brave and mighty protesters, just like the ones we're seeing outside right now. Those protests and organizers were on the ground, leading for change and making the entire world pay attention. I want to know what you learned from those grassroots activists. What have you carried from those conversations in Ferguson with you through to the work that you did then and that you're doing now?
Yeah, well, it's good to see you again. And thank you, President Obama, for convening us here today. You know, I remember back in 2014, I remember meeting with the president. We were on vacation and talking about whether or not I should go to Ferguson. It was a risky thing. Didn't know exactly how people would react to my presence, but we made the determination that I would go. And I think the thing that struck me the most was there were a few things that really got me. I mean, there were young people who were there and who were unbelievably impressive, who were in a lot of ways directing the actions that you saw on the streets. You saw a community that was in anguish, and there was a commonality with regard to the things that they were concerned about. I was really struck by the fact that people consistently talked about the way in which people of color were unfairly treated by the criminal justice system. And there was a genuine desire by people to make things better. It wasn't all about just complaining. There was a genuine desire to work, to make things better. And I left there actually heartened by what I saw, both in terms of the reaction that I got. People were extremely respectful, and I thought we had good dialogues while I was there. But I also left with the notion that if we invested some time, if we invested some federal resources, that we would be in a position using the great leaders that we met there, those young people who we met there, to make life in Ferguson better, and then use that as an example of what was possible in the rest of the country.
So as the president reminded us, this is not about an either or question, right? One of my favorite things to remind people, as President Obama has already done, is that this is not about policy or protest. This is about policy and protest. And that we know, as Dr. King and so many others throughout history taught us, is that protest is actually what creates the pressure so that the policy can get passed. Similarly, we are in a long-term game and a short-term game here. That while we are dealing with radical imagination and reimagining what public safety can look like, even beyond police in our communities, we also have to make sure that people are safe now. In your role as Attorney General, you did a lot of that work in addressing people's safety right now. So can you tell us what you learned that was instructive for this moment, particularly as you engaged in pattern and practice investigations and consent decrees if situations like this happened in communities and once we saw the kind of uprisings that we did all over the country when you were still in office?
Well, I think one of the key things that people have to understand is that there's not a tension between justice and having fair treatment and public safety. You can keep people safe and also have a better, more equitable criminal justice system. I mean, I'm not going to get too boastful here, but, for the first time in 40 years during the Obama administration, we reduced the number of people who were incarcerated in the federal system and also lowered the crime rate. Again, there is not that tension. You can make things better in terms of community and police relationships and keep people safe at the same time. And so what we tried to do was come up with ways in which we could look at what we thought were the problems in the criminal justice system, and with regard to how policing was done, address those, involve the community in those efforts, engage law enforcement in those efforts, bring them together in forums so that they could get to know each other, understand how difficult it is to be a police officer, understand how communities of color have had to deal with unfair law enforcement practices over the years, bring people together. And it was through that, through those kinds of meetings that we were able to formulate the policies that ultimately led to the 21st century proposals. And then the other things that we did, bringing pattern and practice in investigations, using the power that we had under the civil rights statutes that we were able to enforce. It was for me the highlight of my time as Attorney General. It was given the opportunity to get into communities, to affect positive change, to bring and establish relationships between, again, people in law enforcement, people in communities of color. That was, I think, in some ways, what I'm most proud of, and it laid, I think, the foundation for future work. But I will always emphasize this: that young people, that's our audience here today. Young people were critically involved in all of the work that we did, starting at Ferguson and other parts of the country.
I want to ask you one more question before I move on to our next speaker. At Campaign Zero, we believe we can live in a world where the police don't kill people. So many of us are really trying to engage in radical imagination to imagine what our communities look like I said, even beyond police, even looking at a moment where we don't even have traditional systems because our communities are so healthy from the ground up. When you think about your most radical dream for what is possible, your most radical imagination for where we can get to as a community and as a people, what is that dream?
That's an interesting one. I guess my dream is that we would get to a place where people are judged on their individual deeds, the individual characteristics, and that we don't stereotype people. And that is not only with regard to how we do things in the criminal justice system. I think we make a mistake if we think that the criminal justice system exists separate and apart from the greater society. The issues that we face in the criminal justice system, inappropriate uses of force, implicit bias, whole range of things, those grow out of the same kinds of problems that we see in the larger society. And so we've got to deal with problems, they're more systemically, more society-wide, if we want to actually deal and be effective in bringing about needed change with regard to the criminal justice system. So, I would hope that we get to a place where, discrimination is no longer a factor in the lives of people of color. That fair treatment would be something that would be would be expected. But stereotypes, born in slavery, and the notion that, in order to enslave a people, you had to think that they were in some ways different, some ways inferior. And those attitudes may not be as explicit as they once were, but still are a part, I think, of the American psyche implicitly. And radical change, I'd like to, erase those feelings and base policy on, on real world experiences, on the reality of the people of this nation, as opposed to the perceptions of them, the stereotypes of them.
What I hear you is saying is that being able to live, being able to breathe, not having anyone's foot on your neck is not actually a radical idea at all, that it is what everybody is owed. Thank you so much, Attorney General Holder, for joining us. I want to move now to Philippe Cunningham, who is a councilman from the city of Minneapolis, where so much of this is centered. Minneapolis is really ground zero in so many ways, as it was home to George Floyd and his family. Philippe, I have so many questions for you, but first I want to know how you're doing and what is happening on the ground in Minneapolis. I see here on the Zoom call my friend Deion Jones, who was peacefully protesting in Los Angeles when he was hit with the rubber bullet. And we've seen so many images of that kind of unnecessary confrontation, and a lot of them, unfortunately, are coming from Minneapolis. So how is home? How is the home team doing? And what do we outside of Minneapolis need to understand about what's going on the ground?
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that question. I too just want to start off with naming that I'm here today because of the strength of my ancestors and elders who came before me fighting the fight to make my existence and work as an elected official possible. So on the ground in Minneapolis, folks are mobilizing on a scale we've never seen before, and a diverse coalition, a very diverse coalition of folks is emerging demanding justice, not only for George Floyd, but justice in how the city of Minneapolis protects its residents. What we are seeing right now from folks on the ground in Minneapolis and across the country is generations of trauma and rage at the violence bestowed on the Black community and the disinvestment of the Black community by the state at every single level of government. And I'll just add that I myself, as a Black, queer, transgender man, I too live firsthand both the trauma and the trauma that I have to carry around experiencing and witnessing state-sanctioned violence, as well as the generational trauma of my ancestors who survived slavery. So seeing all of this, layering it on, what's interesting about the fact that all of this has really been ground zero in Minneapolis is that we are an incredibly progressive city. At the same time, we are also the city that has the most significant racial disparities between white and Black folks in the entire country across every indicator of quality of life. So this has just been boiling under the surface. I've been in office now for 2.5 years. And within my first 2 years, I had to deal with 3 officer-involved shooting deaths in my ward alone, including one that was a suicide by cop. The trauma from those incidents doesn't just dissipate because the legal system deems their deaths justified. The evidence is clear overall. President Obama spoke to the data that we're starting to see. Over-policing, criminalization, and mass incarceration have not kept our communities safer. In fact, people getting caught in the criminal justice system further disenfranchises Black and brown folks, pushing us further to the margins of society due to criminal histories, thus triggering a cycle of involvement with crime in the criminal justice system that is often passed intergenerationally. So what we're seeing on the ground in Minneapolis is folks saying enough is enough. And our system is obviously broken, and it's time for a new system of public safety in our city. Over the years, we have heard from folks who believe that the solution is simply adding more police officers. And we've also heard from folks who are reformers who want to advocate for incremental change. But even those voices right now are waning because our whole city has seen for the past 3